The Summer Palace was a sprawling complex in the northwest of Rimune, occupying an area larger than the Royal Palace and Prime Estates of Hobans combined. Starting from atop a cliff overlooking the Western Ocean where the palace itself was perched, its grounds ran along the coast to the sandy beaches a kilometre to the south. Before the reign of Queen Kalka, the Summer Palace was reserved for the exclusive use of the royal dynasty and its guests. Upon her ascension, however, the young Holy Queen opened the palace to the public. Both royals and the nobility alike protested the decision, but Kalka was adamant, claiming that it would help bring the Holy Kingdom's people together. In a frenzy of the idealistic energy characteristic of her reign, Queen Kalka had the palace's expansive gardens and beaches transformed into parks for public recreation. The arcades were turned into markets while the auditoriums and galleries were converted into theatres and stages. The palace itself, thankfully, was still treated as private property. While the changes were implemented, her naysayers bided their time, waiting for their chance to criticize the Holy Queen for her foolish idealism when her monstrously wasteful project inevitably failed, except it didn't. Citizens sailed in from all across the country during the quiet winter months and holy days, transforming the Summer Palace into a bustling center of culture and commerce. Needless to say, the hundreds of thousands of people who visited it every year earned immense revenues for the crown. Even demi-humans and heteromorphs frequented the place, and the gates of the palace were continually buried in gifts from subjects who wished to show their appreciation for the Queen's kindness and progressive vision. There were no gifts at the gate now, however, only flowers left by the citizens who still mourned the late Holy Queen's passing. That damned fool couldn't even do the one thing he was supposed to. Duke Dennis de Bonai brooded silently as he stared out at the distant city from a window of his palace office. The new Holy King's duty, first and foremost, was to lead. He didn't even have to rule, he had a cabinet staffed with capable ministers and the entire royal court to assist with that. Yet, whenever the people of the Holy Kingdom thought of their sovereign, it was the late Holy Queen who still stood at the forefront of their minds. Caspond may as well have been a dried fish for all his subjects cared. Actually, his subjects would probably care more about the dried fish if what he heard about the royalist-controlled lands to the east was accurate. The mountain of problems with their new sovereign should have been unacceptable to both the royal dynasty and the aristocratic establishment, but the progressives of the nation saw the weakness of the Holy King as an opportunity to bring the change that they desired to the Holy Kingdom. Now, the country was suffering from a political and economic schism that divided its people into two camps with no hope for reconciliation in sight. "Your Grace," a footman approached him from the grand foyer. "A rider from the front gate just came in. The Faceless One and her entourage have arrived." "How large is the entourage?" Dennis asked. "2 carriages. One carrying merchants, which we redirected to a guest house. An armed company of light cavalry running escort. The Faceless One has 3 attendants, a butler, a maid, and a bard." Dennis asked no further questions, rising from his seat and tugging at the flaps of his coat. The footman bowed before returning to the foyer. "The Faceless One, Count Vigo rose along with him. "It would be nice if we had an actual name, but I suppose that would ruin the mystique. It's preposterous that we're meeting this fellow without even knowing that much. A sign of the times, Your Grace. Times that should hopefully come to an end soon." Lord Vigo accompanied Dennis as he made his way to the palace foyer. It was supposed to have been Marquis Baudepo accompanying him, but he had been called to lead the forces taking the Rinclusa Valley. Dennis could only think that it had been a purposely timed move by the royalists to keep the highly capable Marquis from coordinating his followers from collaborating with the rest of the conservative faction. In the foyer, various noble guests of the palace were arriving to receive the new arrival. Most had looks that were more curious than anything else. To many, the Faceless Ones, or, rather, who they represented, rise to power was like a tale from the distant past when the original nobles of the Holy Kingdom carved out their territories from the devastation and chaos left in the wake of the demon gods. Through the glass of the doors, a dozen lightly armed riders came ahead of a carriage that one might expect of a wealthy merchant. Another set of riders dismounted to open the doors. An odd, masked figure of less than average height wearing a rugged rancher's outfit stepped out. Dennis frowned at the sight, but Count Vigo stirred in recognition. "Naya Baraha," he breathed. "I don't see how you can identify anyone when they're wearing a domino mask, Lord Vigo. This isn't a masquerade, for the god's sake." "It's because she's wearing a mask," Your Grace. You're not making any sense. Back during the war, Count Vigo replied, she wore a mask more often than not. Not the same mask, mind you, but it's hard to imagine her without one. The huge crowd gathered at the city's northeastern gate should have said it all, but I somehow didn't make the connection. In that case, what does this mean for us? Before her arrival, they treated the Faceless One as the representative of Los Ganaderos, a loose coalition of ranchers that occupied roughly a quarter of the North's developed interior. Their faction already traded with them heavily and, aside from that, the ranchers could come in useful if violence broke out. Theirs would be a simple negotiation, as far as Dennis was concerned. Now, the Faceless One was the leader of a movement whose core philosophy could be summed up as work harder, you idiots. In the wake of the Demon Emperor's invasion, when land and opportunity were plentiful, that philosophy had worked in their favor. Their resulting successes, of course, attracted even more followers. To the nobles who had come to aid in the North's recovery efforts, the quaint group had proven to be an economic boon. With the arrival of the Faceless One, however, they had become a faction with real military power that also represented a not insubstantial portion of the land's total industrial activity. The Faceless One's appearance in Rimian and the coming negotiations would be crucial in determining whether she and her followers would become useful allies or a new enemy. As Dennis waited at the head of the reception, a gust of wind stole the Faceless One's wide-brimmed hat. To his shock, she tried to chase after it. The bard, who was about the age of his granddaughter, stopped her and sent one of their escorts to retrieve the hat. She was raised as a commoner, then. The bard acts as a behavioral consultant. Anything that the bard is capable of will be several orders of magnitude more adept than her employer. The butler and maid were clearly just for show, as were the carriage and escort. Dennis adjusted his expectations downwards by several notches, then smiled as the Faceless One and her party approached. Welcome to the Summer Palace, Nayabaraha. I am Duke Dennis de Bonai. I hope you'll forgive the state of the palace grounds. Yaldabaoth's armies made extensive use of the place. Many of the demi-humans occupying Rimian during the war preferred the green spaces of the Summer Palace, and thus its grounds had become the site of all manner of horrific activities. It was to the degree that the temples even insisted that every square meter of the premises be scoured for traces of negative energy and demonic influence in the aftermath of the city's liberation. The masked woman replied with a simple curtsy which looked quite strange with her pants and riding chaps. Thank you for your welcome, Your Grace. I commanded one of the regiments during the liberation of Rimian, and we spent 3 days clearing the Summer Palace of demi-humans. It was heartbreaking to see Queen Kalka's legacy so defiled. Dennis weighed the woman's response. His apology was meant as bait, but he had not received any of the expected replies. Usually, there were two one would render following an apology like his. The first was a cordial one that helped the host save face while also giving the guest an appearance of grace. The second was for the guest to perceive the apology as a sign of the host's weakness and go on the offensive. Out of the two, the first response was by far the most common, as parties would usually spend time feeling out others' positions before taking a decisive course of action. The second response was generally the realm of classless cretins, but it could also mean that the power balance was so wildly skewed that one was confident that they could brush off any consequences of their actions. Nayabaraha's response, however, had the feel of a talking point that just happened to conveniently line up with his apology. However, while it served as a way to deflect his probing attack, it also prematurely revealed a portion of the other party's strategy. She seeks to leverage her history as a war leader and an influential figure amongst the citizenry at a time when both qualities are undeniably attractive, so much for just negotiating supplies. Dennis maintained a cautiously neutral stance as he introduced the other nobles, using their calculated exchanges to gauge Nayabaraha's disposition and intent. The woman's responses, however, were markedly plain and somewhat clumsy. He glanced at the other members of her party to see how they reacted, but spent most of his time watching the bard, who hovered at Baraha's shoulder, not quite looking like a nervous mother at her daughter's matchmaking session. This girl is young, but she's dangerous. The bard's coaching was rigid and the result was awkward. Yet, what mattered was present, and the morsel of information that Nayabaraha had offered kept the other nobles on a predictable course of discussion. If the entire sequence was purposely calculated in advance, only a handful of the nobles present were capable of contending with the bard. It was better to focus their time and energy on Baraha, but that in itself had the makings of a ploy. It took an hour to get through the entire group of noblemen and their families, at which point they proceeded to the Great Hall. No one had been able to pry any new information out of Baraha, so he decided her defense was at least strong enough that one had to land their attacks right on the mark to evoke a non-standard response. Count Vigo was one of the men he thought could dislodge Baraha from her stubborn defense, but, in the end, he had little choice but to recall their shared wartime experience with the few minutes they had together. As far as diplomatic tactics went, it was blunt, but effective. In whatever limited time she had, the Bard had trained her employer to reliably raise a wall against nobles with decades of experience. As a long-term strategy, it was inflexible and prone to shattering at some point, yet he couldn't think of a better way if he was in the same position. With the introductions taken care of, Baraha's attendants went to transfer her luggage to her stateroom while Baraha and her Bard, a foreign traveler who went by the name of Say, joined Dennis and the rest of the nobles in the Great Hall for a late dinner. The Faceless One took her seat to Dennis' immediate right while Count Vigo was seated to his left. Baraha's Bard went to seat herself at a chair on the floor, tuning her lute. As the familiar tune of Winds of Rimion filled the hall, dinner's first course, a light consommé rendered from the latest delivery of top-grade Southern Lanka, Dennis skipped over the usual assessments that nobles tended to use on one another to probe his new guest about her long-term goals. Word of Iago Lauser's passing reached us less than a day after the representative that you sent to arrange a meeting with us left, he said. Am I correct in assuming that the recent change in your relationship with the Royalists means that you've come to secure a new source of supplies for your people?
Yes, that's right, Baraha nodded. Would that be possible, Your Grace?
Industries in the south were never directly disrupted by the Demon Emperor's invasion, Dennis said. With the summer harvest in the south complete, our granaries are well stocked. The challenge will lie in logistics, as transport is limited. Mr. Lauser made sure his dealings with both factions were equal in hopes that he would be seen as a neutral party. We'll need to quadruple our shipments from your faction since the Royalists took over Lloyd's. Dennis nodded in agreement. Draft animals were used to deliver cargo inland, meaning that a not insubstantial portion of a wagon's cargo capacity had to be set aside for feed. A horse pulled as much as it weighed and ate 10 kilograms of feed per day, plus roughly the same amount in water. When one included the provisions for the wagon operators and the average escort per wagon, it took a huge bite out of how much cargo could be delivered. If one assumed the average trip length from Rimion to the former holdings of Iago Lauser, only about half the cargo capacity of each wagon could be used for delivering goods. This accounted for extra supplies just in case of poor weather and road conditions, of course. Additionally, they needed twice as many animals, vehicles, and caravaneers to maintain the same throughput as before. Can something be done to recover Lloyd's, instead?
Lord Vigo asked.
I'm not sure, the Faceless One looked down at her soup. I don't know how the Royalists took over in the first place. The only metric that matters to the Crown are those blasted numbers of theirs, Lord Vigo said. For the good of the people, we weren't willing to stoop to the depraved methods that the Royalists were. Depraved methods? Baraha's lips turned down at the corners, though with her mask he couldn't tell what sort of expression she wore. Was it truly necessary to wear such a thing if everyone was aware of her identity? From what I saw of Lloyd's, my lord, she said, they're setting things up just like they have in Hobans. You mean establishing those labor camps that rob the cities and towns of their livelihoods and the Crown of its revenues? The Faceless One nodded. Dennis sighed internally. His people had spent weeks trying to figure out how to legally break the Royalists' hold on Hobans, but there was simply no way for them to do so without resorting to the same tactics or breaking the law outright. The only legitimate way that we know of to return the cities under Royalist control to their former state, Dennis said, requires the return of the Royal Army. And that the Crown even cares, Lord Vigo said. Caspon seems all too happy to see his power steadily eroded by the Royalists. I sympathize with his condition, but that very condition should have disqualified him for rule. We had no say in the matter. Dennis' voice grew dark. He simply ascended as if he thought he was in Riestais or the Empire. Without the approval of the royal dynasty and the High Lords of Roblé, his rule should be illegitimate. It still confounded him as to how such a thing could be allowed to happen. At the urging of the Royalists, the man had simply taken the throne and the rest of the country was so weakened by the war that they could do nothing about it. Now it was as if the country was a galleon being slowly crushed in the coils of a sea dragon.
In that case, Baraha said, what does your faction plan on doing?
The only thing to do is consolidate power and wait for our candidate. God's willing, Prince Felipe will arrive with the fleet before the end of summer. Once the Admiralty joins its strength to ours, our advantage over the Royalists will be undeniable.
So the prince will declare himself the Holy King.
The legitimate Holy King. But that means civil war, doesn't it, Your Grace?
We'll give the Royalists the chance to back down first, Dennis said.
With the fleet on our side, the war for the throne will be won before it even begins. Our enemies will lose control of the seas, and that will be that.
They should understand this, as well.
And if they refuse to withdraw their support of King Caspond,
then justice must be served.
The Faceless One fell silent for several minutes. Dennis and his other guests took the opportunity to turn their attention to dinner's second course while she deliberated.
I, too,
desire justice for the Holy Kingdom, Baraha said at long last. But,
I don't see things the way that
the aristocracy does. All I want is a place where my people can thrive and be happy. Does the state of the West and its citizens not serve to demonstrate who truly has the interests of the people at heart?
Dennis asked. What you see cannot be fabricated, nor have we done anything to appease you in particular.
With the threat of demi-human incursions from the Abelian Hills permanently at an end, our country faces a bright and prosperous future. The unfortunate, mentally ill man on the throne and those who manipulate him must be removed for us to realize it.
I can agree on that point.
But to prepare for the future. Of course, Dennis nodded. So long as you can arrange for transport of your supplies overland, we will arrange for them to be shipped. We brought some merchants who can deal with your merchants if that's all right. It's good that you've come prepared. We'll let them handle those matters while we move on to other topics of import. Dinner moved on to the main course, which consisted of buttered lobster with a hearty portion of crisp greens and garlic bread. The bard changed her selection to a piece he had never heard before. The lyrics were unfamiliar in their construction. Human songs and poetry tended to center around human life and events. Very rarely were they about countries or regions of countries, though every country had at least one or two of those works. This song, however, was purely in praise of the raw, wild nature in and around the Azalisia Mountains.
I don't believe I'm familiar with this song, Dennis said.
It's called Winter's Crown, Baraha said as she weaved back and forth in her seat with the melody.
Say said that humans first heard it in the Sorceress Kingdom.
Humans first heard. Did that mean the composer of the piece was a demi-human or heteromorph?
Now that she mentioned it, the lyrics did bear similarities to the songs of the Holy Kingdom's aquatic neighbors. At least supposedly.
Humans were unable to speak aquatic languages and literature didn't translate itself, so all he had to go by were crude translations that obviously fell short of the original works. The melody, however, was drastically different from even those pieces, sounding so primal that he thought he might be sucked into the pristine realm that the song exalted. Is it very popular in the Sorceress Kingdom?
Count Vigo asked.
Say said that it's popular in the regions around the Azalisia Mountains, Baraha answered. Both in the Sorceress Kingdom and the Baharuth Empire. She's not sure whether it's spread to Riastais yet. Speaking of the Sorceress Kingdom, Dennis said, have you maintained any of the connections that you've made there? The only person from the Sorceress Kingdom that I spent much time with was His Majesty the Sorcerer King, so. That's already one hell of a connection, woman. Or so he wanted to say, but he held his tongue. The Faceless One shifted in her seat as the nobles at the table all leveled expectant looks at her. She licked her lips nervously. His Majesty has already done so much that I don't think it would be appropriate to ask for more. Commoners had a nonsensical sense of propriety and Baraha seemed about as common could get. If one never communicated their needs and desires, then chances were that those who could facilitate them would never know, especially if they were physically distant. He and the members of his faction were as averse to the undead as anyone, but political pressure from the Sorceress Kingdom would likely spell the end of Caspond with a minimum of fuss. Was it possible to press the issue? A courier would take at least 3 weeks to reach Erantle and waiting for an audience could add considerably to that. By the time they received an answer, there was a high chance that Prince Felipe would already be back and Dennis was fairly certain about how the fleet would react to any dealings with the undead. I see, he said. In that case, we'll see what solutions we can devise with the addition of your people's assistance. If things took a dire turn, he could bring up the topic again. Their near-term goal remained the same, which was the consolidation of power to eventually employ against the Royalists. The Faceless One's influence and territorial control would serve to further strengthen their position and give their opponents a much larger strategic threat to consider. Winter's Crown transitioned into a wordless tune that bore a rhythm and chord progressions favored by Baharuth's martial aristocracy. Just to be clear, Your Grace, Baraha said, not all of my people are combatants or should be treated as such. It was an utterly odd statement to make. Every able-bodied adult in the Holy Kingdom had served in the army, so everyone could be fielded as a combatant. Do you mean to say that they won't qualify as capable combatants due to the current situation in the north? If so, something can be arranged to remedy that. Yes, and no. Your Grace is correct to say that we don't have the means to equip and deploy them, but neither did we intend to use them as military assets in the first place. The other nobles at the table showed no visible reaction to her statement, yet the mix of anger and disdain emanating from them was palpable. A man who wouldn't fight for their land was no man at all. In that case, Dennis said, what do you and your people intend to contribute to the cause? It's not that we won't contribute soldiers if they're needed. But we have people suited to those roles, and undermining our industrial production won't allow us to fight prolonged conflicts. We also have to consider what happens afterwards. Crippling the North even further is something we'd all like to avoid if possible. It's pragmatic, but a merchant would have probably accepted the proposal after attempting to squeeze out as much profit as they could out of it. The pursuit of profit, however, was not the way of the aristocracy. What you say does appeal to a certain line of reasoning, Dennis said, but, as anyone in the Holy Kingdom should know, prosperity without the strength to protect it will only be stolen. All things being equal, our people would consider it unjust if such an exemption is made for yours. I agree, Baraha replied, but all things are not equal. My forces have all fought in the war and they are almost purely light cavalry. If necessary, I can have 2,000 of them available. This should be more than what a count is expected to contribute in terms of fighting strength, so considering us an equal partner should present no issues. Furthermore, my forces control the northwestern interior and the Royalists are incapable of challenging us there. If things do come down to civil war, that will give your armies access to Lloyd's and Hobans without risking an amphibious landing and exposing your supply lines. Low murmurs rose from the seated nobles. That she had professional troops not even a count could offer for the war effort came as a surprise to all of them. For Dennis' part, he had a hunch that she would turn Los Ganaderos into an ad hoc militia, but he wasn't sure whether she would be willing to commit them to a conflict. This regiment of light cavalry, one of the nobles halfway down the table said. Could it be that you're offering the men of Los Ganaderos? That's right, my lord, Baraha nodded. Then you'll forgive me for saying so, but there is too much at stake for us to simply take you at your word. Can you prove that they are as effective as you say? The music stopped. Dennis calmly took a sip out of his wine glass. Since Baraha had offered cavalry, the challenge was inevitable to nobles who considered cavalry the domain of the elite. Of course, the Faceless One replied without hesitation. Shall we decide on a time and a place? Stop saying Did you become a Buddhist? Don't they say Say sent an unamused look across the table at her. I couldn't help it. Naya flopped listlessly onto one of the incalculably expensive-looking couches in her stateroom. There were so many people watching me. Aren't you already used to speaking in front of crowds? I am, but this is different. Plus, they were all nobles. It felt as if a coven of vampires was trying to suck something out of me. Every minute from the moment she entered the palace was exhausting. Usually, she could muster seemingly unlimited energy to speak with people, but interacting with Duke de Bona and his cohort was downright oppressive. Maybe they were using skills, Say said. Skills? As far as Naya knew, nobles didn't have skills. Only powerful warriors like her father and the elite paladins did. Yeah, Say said. A skill. One that makes you go a skill. That's ridiculous. How can there be such a skill? Why not? It seems useful. It made you sound like an inferior orator and it was throwing you off. That's true, but only demi-humans and heteromorphs had weird skills. Humans were normal. Naya rolled over to face the backrest of her couch. She was so tired she could barely think.
At least our strategy worked, she said.
Kind of, Say replied. We knew that they would probably use the trade agreement to hook us. How things play out hinges on us proving how useful we'll be to them. Their strategy, if one could call it that, had been to take advantage of the idea that she was an unsophisticated commoner. This in itself wasn't exactly wrong when she compared herself to the nobles, but it felt odd nonetheless. Naya restricted herself to a few talking points and feigned ignorance or disinterest in everything else. This, in turn, would cause the nobles to frame her as a certain type of asset and focus on discerning her usefulness as one. In all, it wasn't hard to accomplish since Say's coaching similarly focused on topics related to what they were going for, and Naya had no confidence talking to the nobles about anything else anyway. Additionally, Say used spell songs to increase Naya's competency for the duration of the discourse, which the bard disguised as the tuning at the beginning of dinner and between songs. Since nobles were used to treating servants and performers as invisible or part of the background, they hadn't noticed at all. They only praised the quality and breadth of the musical selection that they were supposed to hear. Wait, doesn't that mean I'm the only one that looked bad back there? Miss Baraja, Mrs. Diaz entered the drawing room. Would you like to have a bath drawn? I'm fine, thank you. Say used that towel thing on me before we got off the carriage. I just want to sleep. I'll prepare everything right away, Mrs. Diaz said. The sound of Say's lute filled the chamber with a soft melody. Naya flipped over to either bard. You performed throughout dinner without breaks, Naya said. Aren't you tired of playing that thing? No. What do you think will happen tomorrow? Not much. The nobles need time to put together a satisfactory force for their test, so we have the merchants' negotiations and that's about it, I think. In that case, Mr. Morrow said from where he was attending to them, would you like to speak to the people, Miss Baraja? Now that she had some sense of how her words affected people in various situations, she was actually hesitant to speak in Rimune. Everyone seemed content as they were, and it would feel devastating to have her message fall on deaf ears when so many of her followers were around. Furthermore, she was still reworking key points in her message so that they were more applicable in times of peace. Instead of public speaking, Na said, could we visit members of the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps? I'd like to see how they've applied His Majesty's wisdom to their everyday lives. Of course, Miss Baraja. That would probably help. Hopefully, she would be able to understand what was going on. The following morning, Naya found herself lying abed in a solar that immediately induced anxiety in her. It was so big and fancy that it may as well have been a manor in itself. She couldn't recall how she had gotten there. After a long stretch and a yawn, she rolled out of bed and went to peek through the curtains. It was already mid-morning. Outside, a small army of gardeners and their assistants worked to restore the palace grounds to their former glory. Pretty much everything had been churned up by the demi-humans' activity, putting the gardens, parks, and venues into a dire state of disrepair. Naya left the window and went looking for her clothes, finding most of them draped over a chair nearby. Mrs. Diaz appeared with her freshly ironed shirt. Good morning, Miss Baraja, the buxom woman smiled. Good morning, Mrs. Diaz. Oh, you're growing out your hair. I didn't notice yesterday since you had it up. Keeping it short would remind me of my days imprisoned by Yaldabaoth's armies, so I figured I'd let it grow until it starts to annoy me. For some reason, the longer hair made her seem gloomier than usual, but her choice was more than understandable. Did I miss anything? The merchants left to conduct their negotiations in the warehouse district at dawn. I should have gone with them. Mr. Morrow went along. Mrs. Diaz carefully placed Naya's shirt over a chair before going to make her bed. None of the nobles were present, so it's probably for the best that you didn't go. I see. What about Say? She's in the solar office. That girl refuses to stray very far from you, so you two must be very close. She's astonishingly strong, as well. Mr. Morrow has a bad back, so she carried you from the couch in the drawing room to your bed. Say slept in the office? Honestly, this bed is so stupidly huge that she could have Have you seen my mask? Mrs. Diaz's gloomy look faded as she smiled slightly. Why, it's on your face, Miss Baraja. Naya's hand went to her face. She hadn't even noticed that the mask was there. Her face really was going to disappear, at this rate. Does that mean Say left it on my face on purpose? She left the bedroom to find the bard behind the office desk. A tome that might have passed for trebuchet ammunition lay open before her.
"What are you reading?"
"History,"
Say replied.
"I know I should have expected as much, but it's very Robley-ish."
"What does that mean?"
"Extremely biased, I guess. Instead of the history of the world, it should be called History According to Robley. Well, more like History According to Robley's nobles. There's barely anything in here older than what happened on the peninsula after the demon gods." The desire to root out bits of lore from wherever they could find it seemed to be common to all bards. Naya's education revolved around combat and judicial duties and didn't include any unrelated history, so Say probably already knew more about the Holy Kingdom's history than she did. "Have you ever wondered about our history?" Say asked. "Our history? You know, the stuff that everyone knows. Like the demon gods. If you sift through the records and filter out all of the embellishment and attempts at patrons to aggrandize themselves, there's pretty much nothing."
"Nothing? There must be something."
Say shook her head, sweeping her hand palm upwards over the book. "It's all common knowledge. That the demon gods existed and destroyed everything. A few stories about the 13 heroes. We know that they won, but not where and how, and we know that a dragon god ended their adventures after that."
"Is that so?
I always thought that was just what we know and people elsewhere had their own stories about them."
"I think most would think that," Say said.
"But if you travel from place to place, especially as a bard, it's pretty noticeable. It's all the same story and there are no details that give you a sense of who, what, when, where, why, and how for almost everything. It's almost as if the story was purposely made that way so it could be accepted everywhere. But we know for a fact that the demon gods existed. We also know that everything was destroyed and we built on top of what came before."
"I'm not saying that they didn't exist," Say said.
"I'm just saying that the stories around them are oddly uniform wherever you go in the human world." "Shouldn't that be because of the theocracy?" Naya said. "We have their version of the story because humanity spread out from there after the demon gods were defeated." "That could account for much of it," the bard sighed and closed the book. "I suppose I was just hoping for something more substantial out of a tome from a royal library." Sorry we disappointed you." "Stop saying Naya's mouth snapped shut and she left the office. A breakfast of fluffy buttered bread, sausage, eggs, and fish stew awaited her in the suite's dining room. She settled down for her meal, sorting out her clouded memories of the previous day. "We're supposed to be visiting people today, I think?" As important as her talks with the conservatives were, she wanted nothing more than to get back to spreading the Sorcerer King's wisdom and increasing the number of people who understood His Majesty's greatness. Now that she could focus her time and energy on those efforts, she could refine her message and help restore justice to the lands being strangled to death by the royalists. Mr. Morrow returned an hour before noon and together they took their carriage to the common areas of Rimune. Naya eyed the flowers piled at the palace gates as they passed through them. "I should offer some flowers," she said. "It's terrible how life under the royalists is so rigid that people lose their sense of everything but themselves. Queen Kanka would have been horrified to see the Holy Kingdom today." "What was the Holy Queen like?" Say asked. "It looks like the people loved her a lot." "She caused a lot of controversy by simply existing," Naya answered, "but I'm pretty sure most of the citizens loved her." "Controversy?" Naya's gaze rested on a ruined theater as their carriage rolled by. She remembered watching several plays there when she had visited Rimune as a child with her parents. The Holy Kingdom has always had a holy king. Kalka ascended the throne due to her appearance and power. They even had to make a new title for her because she couldn't be the Holy King. "That sounds a bit like imperial culture," Say said. "It does?" She couldn't recall any notable empresses, though her knowledge of world history was even more dismal than her Robley history. More specifically, imperial military culture, the bard told her. Baharuth society is dominated by men, just like the Holy Kingdom, but it developed differently. In Robley, you have universal mandatory military service. In Baharuth, the martial aristocracy remained at the forefront of military affairs and their culture evolved into the traditions and organizational structure of the imperial army. Women from the martial aristocracy are treated very differently from civilian women. They're not wives and mothers to be provided for and protected, they're war leaders who defend their fiefs against monsters and raiders while their husbands and brothers are away from home serving in the imperial army. Once in a while, A woman from that group is so strong that they decide it's worth it to serve in the army. So now you have this noble woman of good breeding who is already beautiful, who also happens to be strong, and personal strength is also always seen as desirable. Then you attach that image of the stalwart leader who can always be relied upon to defend hearth and home, and it all comes together to create a living idol. An icon of a proud military establishment that everyone respects and adores. Naya wondered how her mother would have done in the Imperial Army. She had been recognized as one of the Holy Kingdom's elite paladins, but little of what Say described happened here. Strong, capable women were usually viewed as disruptions to social order at best, or perhaps ill-fitting tools. I think women like that would be seen as an object here, Naya said. In the sexual sense. That's not bad in itself, is it? Say asked, though I guess it might be annoying if that was the only thing that people cared about. Queen Kalka had the endorsement of the temples since she was such a powerful priest, as well, Naya said. You're probably right about the idol thing, though. She was an existence that could only be admired from afar by most, and no one would dare try anything on the Holy Queen, so her looks and strength worked in her favor. What was her reign known for? Social reform, maybe? I think that her policies were a good thing, but I might be biased because I'm from the city like she was. So she promoted policies that favored the cities? Naya shook her head. No, she tried to. I'm not sure how to say it. I guess she tried to bridge the gap between rural and urban society. She wanted a more cosmopolitan country that accepted ideas from abroad, even from non-humans. The Summer Palace, for instance, was turned into a public space with all sorts of attractions, and she encouraged everyone to visit on holy days. She was probably more successful with the commoners than the aristocracy. Because the nobles saw it as a cultural attack. She nodded at the bard's characteristically astute conjecture. The conservatives were very loud about how the Holy Queen was trying to encourage the people to adopt corrupt, immoral urban values in an underhanded effort to erode society and undermine the power of the aristocratic establishment. To the progressives of the time, however, she was the wrong sort of progressive who focused on what they considered frivolous policies. Both sides considered her soft, and being a woman only served as proof of that in their eyes. That's interesting, Say said. No, it's terrible. I meant the divide between rural and urban society and how the late Holy Queen tried to address it. It's almost the exact opposite of what happened in the Baharuth Empire. I don't actually know much about the empire. Their carriage shuddered as it crossed the threshold of the Summer Palace's southeastern gate. The scenery was replaced by the gardens and manors of Remyon's prime estates. Its residents, the southern conservatives that had come to help administer the north, had been quick about fixing the place up after they moved in. Baharuth's emperors were what you'd consider progressive, but in the way that your progressives would have wanted. They prioritized military power and territorial expansion, industries that were considered practical, and the integration of arcane magic into society. Everyone always seems to only have good things to say about the empire. Wait, but doesn't that mean the royalists are right? It depends on what you think is desirable, Say replied. Due to the aggressive pursuit of its imbalanced policies, the Baharuth Empire is a country of haves and have-nots, and the vast majority of its people are a part of the latter. Its people believe in their version of meritocracy, and that also means they believe that those have-nots deserve to be in the situation that they're in. Even the have-nots believe that they just have to work harder to cross over to the other side of the economic fence. In reality, their economy isn't much stronger than Riestize's, and the empire just came up with a way to justify one person being rich at the expense of 1,000 others. But how can that be? No one ever portrays Riestize in the same light as Baharuth. Because they would be insane to do so. The difference between the kingdom and the empire is that the empire was much better at organizing their resources, and they put those resources to good use. Also, the empire conveniently doesn't have a powerful criminal syndicate feeding off of them like Riestize does. After 6 generations or so, the gulf between them has become so vast that most wouldn't imagine that they're roughly equal in economic terms. Also, what merchants and the like, who serve as the primary source of information from foreign lands, see is what the empire wants them to see. Someone visiting our winter stays in the first or second class districts, depending on what their business is. They don't go to the third and fourth class districts where all the poor people are, nor would they ever want to. Those parts of the city rarely see any security patrols, if ever. That almost sounds like how things are here these days. Due to the Holy Kingdom's limited resources, public services went to the most valuable places. It was almost as if people didn't deserve a decent quality of life if they were poor.
Mr. Morrow, Naya said, is it like that around Rimune, too? To an extent, the middle-aged man replied.
Miss Say paints a dire picture, but the truth is that no country in existence
can afford to provide high-quality public services to every single one of their citizens. That is, unfortunately, reality. But that sort of inequality feels unjust. Naya frowned.
There must be a better way.
I suppose it is a matter of expectations, Miss Baraha, Mr. Morrow said. As you've noted, you harbor the biases of urban society.
People in the city expect regular patrols and sentries at every corner, well-stocked markets, a temple on every fourth block and all sorts of other amenities.
9 out of 10 people in the Holy Kingdom do not live in the cities, however. A patrol coming by once every other week to check in on their village is fine. So long as there's a temple within a day's walking distance, they feel that their spiritual and medical needs are met.
If they need specialized goods and services, then they go to the local town which is a day away, at most. In their minds, they have everything that they need.
That seems like an excuse, Naya said.
They're fine with it because they don't know better and others take advantage of that to put their resources to use elsewhere.
I believe that was the rationale of our late Holy Queen, Miss Baraha.
Some may even assert that it was a condescending viewpoint, so it may be advisable to reserve those notions for another time, especially considering that we're dealing with the conservative camp.
Why does everything have to be so complicated?
No, that's wrong. It only seems complicated because we currently lack the strength to uphold our justice.
Weakness was a sin that facilitated iniquity and the suffering that it wrought. Strength was required to enact true change and maintain it.
Their carriage slowed as they crossed into the common area inside Rimune's walls.
Naya still quite couldn't believe what she saw. By almost every measure, the port city, which was perhaps a fifth the size of Hobans before the war, had eclipsed the capital.
The streets and markets were as busy as ever and the masts of ships filled with cargo could be seen peeking up over the southern wall.
Rimune had already left the war behind while Hobans only continued to deteriorate in its aftermath. Who are we visiting first? Naya asked. Mr. Morrow produced a folded parchment from his coat pocket. I've taken the liberty of spreading you out, he said. We'll be seeing people in different parts of the city so that you can, in turn, be seen. Our first stop is the workshop of one Jan Soto in the southeastern quarter. The industrial quarter, huh? What does he do? Mr. Soto runs a lumber yard with 300 employees. Wood and wood products were some of the only exports that the South purchased from the North, so Mr. Soto sounded like an extremely wealthy man. She wondered if all of his employees also followed His Majesty's wisdom. Would that be genuine? Or would it essentially be coercion? Their carriage came in front of a workshop, or, rather, several workshops, attached to a yard the size of a city block. Just before they stopped, a well-dressed man with a mop of brown hair came running out the nearest door. He fidgeted nervously as Naya and her party disembarked, bobbing his head several times as she approached. Miss Baraha, I'm sorry that you had to come all the way here for us. No, Naya bobbed her head several times. I'm sorry for imposing on you like this, Mr. Soto. It's no imposition at all, Mr. Soto bobbed his head back. We're honored that you've taken an interest in our work. Naya jumped mid-head bob as Say poked her in the ribs. Mr. Soto was too preoccupied with bobbing his head to notice. A small crowd started to gather at the spectacle. Mr. Morrow cleared his throat. Mr. Soto. Of course. Please, this way. They were led into an office that had all of its doors and windows opened, yet remained miserably hot. Mr. Soto crossed the building to enter the yard behind it, which was filled with people hard at work. I don't remember this facility being here before, Naya said. It wasn't, Miss Baraha, Mr. Soto said. But demand for our goods was seemingly unlimited during Reconstruction. In accordance with the wisdom of the Sorcerer King, my sons and I worked as hard and as long as we could every day, challenging ourselves to grow stronger. All of the training that the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps conducted during the war undoubtedly helped. In what ways would you say that it helped? Naya asked. Well, we became physically stronger as a result of that training. That, in turn, gave us an undeniable edge over our competitors.
Can you imagine eating and sleeping the same as everyone else yet being able to accomplish twice as much?
I guess you could, Miss Baraha, but it was a complete mystery to anyone who didn't understand His Majesty's wisdom. It made sense for physically intensive vocations. One could use the strength that they gained from the war in their profession. The Sorcerer King Rescue Corps was the only group amongst Roblay's defenders that spent most of their free time out of battle training to become stronger, so the performance of its members probably couldn't be replicated by anyone else. Anyway, Mr. Soto continued, between our profits and the Crown's recognition of our performance, we slowly started buying up the empty shops and yards in the area. After that, we moved on to our competitors. Eventually, we consolidated all of the lumber workshops in the city under us, and we were even granted some of the woodlands around the city by the Crown. He's sort of like Mr. Lauser, except for lumber. That's amazing, Naya said.
It's all thanks to the Sorcerer King, Mr. Soto said.
His Majesty is truly great.
What about your employees?
Naya asked.
Have they come to realize the Sorcerer King's greatness
as well? Not at first, but they eventually came around to it.
It was hard to ignore the fact that normal people just like them were doing so much more than they could.
We did more work at a higher quality and got paid accordingly.
People who heeded His Majesty's wisdom went from barely getting by to being able to buy abandoned properties in the good parts of town, fix them up, and furnish them. They can afford what their families deserve and go to bed without worrying about the next day. Hearing his account was truly edifying. The Sorcerer King's wisdom was unlike the ways they had before the war, where one could only tighten their belts and suffer what they must whenever hardship came along. For the first time ever, they could take control of their lives and forge their own destinies. Mr. Soto stopped occasionally to speak with people and show off their work as they labored in the shaded areas set up around the yard. For some reason, unassuming things like frames for housing and even planks had a sense of being masterfully made. Your workshops produce really high-quality items, Say said.
Don't they?
Mr. Soto grinned. I don't mean to brag, but our business has the distinction of having 2 certified grandmasters. At the rate that things are progressing, we'll have over a dozen by next year. Won't that make your products common enough to affect the price?
Only if we stick to local markets.
There's a whole world out there that'll purchase goods of grandmaster quality. We haven't been dropping our prices at all. Instead, we've been stockpiling inventory for the fleet. Our ship is literally coming in. Naya couldn't help but be impressed by Mr. Soto's good business sense. While the trade fleets were run by the Holy Kingdom's people, one could rightly say that Rimion and Ebonai were merely tiny ports of call along the fleet's massive trade route. The majority of their business was conducted in the distant southeast, and exporting any goods from the Holy Kingdom would help bring in more wealth from there. After 2 hours or so, their tour brought them back out of the yard and across the street. There, Naya was surprised to find a second, smaller yard where dozens of men were drilling and sparring with practice spears.
What's this? She asked.
It's not exactly the same as our time in the army, Mr. Soto said, but we're continuing to strengthen ourselves using a training regimen similar to what we followed during the war. It works just as good now as it did then. Even the new employees show improvement within weeks so long as they don't slack off. Mr. Bertrand, Naya turned to the former steward, is every member of the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps following similar routines? The specifics vary according to vocation, but yes, everyone that I've personally spoken to. Naya sent her gaze over the rows of men training in the yard. All of them were at least as strong as the average career soldier in the Royal Army. Perhaps the noble's reaction to her statement about non-combatants wasn't concern over her unwillingness to commit, but disappointment over the fact that she wouldn't mobilize a 200,000-strong army of battle-hardened veterans to sweep aside all opposition.